Welcome to another episode of the Social Impact Journal with me, Jack Farron, your host. The Social Impact Journal is a global development show where I talk to the founders, innovators, and experts driving change in our world. Today, we have a very fascinating discussion with Cytandra Hoover, a consultant based in the United States who is revolutionizing risk management at the nexus of impact, inclusion, and profit. If you enjoyed today's show, please make sure to give us a follow on our social media channels or subscribe where you're listening or watching. Good morning, Cytandra. I think it's morning in the US, if I'm right.
It's right around lunchtime.
Great. So we're recording this in December. The snow has started in the UK today. So we're heading towards the cold months. But really good to have you on the show. And looking forward to this conversation. We've had a number of episodes around inclusive insurance in the first year of our podcast, but I think this one is going to be really looking into some of those key topics. So before we get started, please do share an introduction of yourself to our audience.
Absolutely. So I'm a social impact and inclusive insurance consultant. I've worked in the space my entire life. My father is a tropical botanist, and so my childhood was spent traveling around the world to very remote locations and countries and seeing various cultures firsthand. And so that really informed the path of the rest of my life. And spent a decade working in international development and social impact with USAID and the UN, and then followed by an additional decade in traditional insurance. And now, for the past year or so, I have been running my own consultancy, really focused on that intersection of impact, inclusion, and profit.
So, tropical botanist, if I heard that right.
Correct.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Where did you travel to when you in your childhood?
All over. So he's the world specialist in begonias, and so spent a lot of time in Mexico and Indonesia. And then later on a little bit in the Philippines, and then a lot of time on my own throughout Latin America, Honduras, back to Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, etc.
Awesome. So you said first 10 years were in international development, working in the UN. So what was your first ever role that involved an element of social impact?
Absolutely. So So the first role I had was working, doing contracting and implementation of USAID and State Department programs. So did that for a few years and then transitioned to go work with the International Organization for Migration, IOM. And I actually started with them in Colombia. So I had already done some work with USAID previously. And right around 2006, Colombia went through a massive peace process with the former paramilitaries of the AUC. And with that came a large injection of capital and program management to help with the reintegration of the paramilitaries into Colombian society. And so I was hired by IOM to help to work on and then lead up part of the program in Colombia. We had about 56,000 beneficiaries that we attended to, with 32 field offices. And so I ran, if I recall correctly, it's 5 or 6 of those field offices, and the bilingual liaison with USAID and reporting. And so traveled to some of the most remote corners of Colombia on trips that required, 3-4 forms of transportation, from, not only plane to bus to motorcycle to donkey and, boat and kind of everything you could imagine. And definitely the best job I've ever had. And so did that for several years, working on that program, and then continued for several more years with IOM and the UN system later on.
Wow. So if I'm hearing right, so you've got, let's say, 3 stages: first in the international development, second in the corporate space, and now third as a self-employed. But it feels like now you're doing a bit of international development and corporate in terms of inclusive insurance. So exactly. I was going to ask what the transition is like from the international development space in the UN and USAID into the corporate. But again, maybe I can ask that question for corporate into startup as well. You've definitely gone through many different transitions.
Yeah, it's very true. And it's interesting because if you look at it from the outside, they all look very different, right? Without any intersection amongst them. But there actually was a logic behind it. So having spent my whole childhood all the way through high school and early college years, really focused on social impact on a global scale. So either with my father's work. I then also worked as a field anthropologist and archaeologist in social impact. I did agricultural development projects for a long time. And then with the UN system and USAID. And so within all of that, I really got to see how development works and what poverty looks like and solutions to poverty and what different approaches work in different locations and partnership models, et cetera. And so I loved the work and I loved the impact. And what I really found was that there was a real struggle of connecting that to sustainable long-term change. And so having run and managed a lot of programs, I then decided after about that decade or so working with the aid and working in development programs to pursue an MBA. And so I use that with formal skills to really be able to complement the social impact, but to take it from a business perspective of how do you run a business and a program from the most efficient perspective possible so that you can then essentially channel even more funds into the impact side, but you're really driving the operational efficiency of a business. And so that's where kind of the MBA was the link. And so then after the MBA, that's then when I went and worked in traditional insurance. And I enjoyed the insurance space because, again, oftentimes insurance is really that moment of time when people are at their most vulnerable and challenging moments. And so how do you look at insurance from the perspective of almost social impact, right? How do you provide a service to someone who has just lost everything? And so during my time with aid and the UN, my focus really was on disaster response and conflict management, migration. So there actually were some very specific themes that carried over into the insurance space. And then combined with my global experience, it worked really well in insurance because we did global insurance. So I covered 18 different countries. And so was able to take that social impact, global experience. I'm a native level Spanish speaker. And so combining all of that together really helped in the insurance space. And so taking the knowledge, but then really learning how to run an efficient business and run an enterprise and build one from the ground up, and looking at different models and, systems and, structures, et cetera. And so did that, all sides of traditional insurance. I did commercial and personal. And anyway, I won't go down the long litany of path of insurance, but really saw it from all sides and all angles of the insurance industry. And so as I nearly concluded about a decade working in the space, I really started to identify that I love the idea of inclusive insurance, right? How do you use insurance and insurance-based models, but for populations that are uninsured, underinsured, don't understand insurance, but then really specifically in this space of vulnerable and marginalized communities on a global scale, right? How can insurance be a model and a tool to help to, provide prevention and resiliency, but then also response during times of calamity and disasters and really as a tool to bring people out of poverty. And so this is actually my third time working as an independent consultant. And so I wasn't entirely blind going into it. But so launched it earlier this year in 2023, so just about a year ago. So it really is that intersection of all of my experience of social impact with traditional insurance, an MBA, plus a background in microfinance.
Wow. So maybe to go back to the MBA. So
Sure.
You've come from the international development sector. You're now looking at how you can use the MBA, in more effective planning of projects and implementation. What was the one key learning that you took away from that MBA process?
To only pick one, I think for me, one of the most critical pieces was learning business efficiency. And so, there were two parts to it. One were financial models. I had done, a decade or plus work doing budgeting and financial modeling and expense management. But being able to combine that with the real hard skills learned in both my MBA and then during the decade in insurance of really understanding financial statements, understanding all of the connections of variables and movements and correlations between data, and being able to really be able to see and figure out how you can run a streamlined and efficient business, but then also, generate profit, and whether that profit goes back to shareholders or it goes back invested into programs and initiatives of the company and beneficiaries. So that was one. And then I think, tangential and related to that is the operational efficiency side. So I got my background and my certification in Lean Six Sigma. And so really being able to understand and, look at process and process optimization and taking out waste out of systems and lag times. So I won't nerd out on that one either. But I really enjoy that. I really enjoy figuring out how to take, waste out of structures and create the most efficient model, but at the same time, making sure that it's being responsive and realistic and reflective of the specific environment that you're working in, right? That a model that works in the US is not going to work in Uganda, and a model that works there is not necessarily going to work in Colombia. And so really being able to understand how to develop these models and these processes and these structures that create efficiency and yet at the same time are really responsive and reflective of the local environment.
Amazing. So insurance. I have a question. Before we go into what inclusive insurance is, why does insurance have such a bad reputation? Because I used to work, that's the start of my career. And I was 16 on cold calls to, construction companies. And they didn't want to know about insurance until their renewal date. I've seen it when we started working as rural inclusion in Uganda, doing research on health insurance and seeing the recipients, the respondents, and their opinions of just the word insurance and the term. So for you having vast experience across the world with insurance, you mentioned earlier that insurance is so critical and people really need it, at those key events in life. So why does it have such a bad reputation? And maybe what can be done to change the narrative?
There are several factors to it. The first one is, I think insurance generally gets a bad rap because of likely legitimate conversations around the denial of claims. And I think that's really the number one reason, right? Is this idea that you pay into it and then when you need it, you don't get it. There are several pieces that go within that. One is this understanding that you pay into a system and the premise is never that you're going to get 100% of it back, right? The premise is that you're paying into a model that is going to provide you that support and the structure that is needed in the time of, when the disasters strike, right? When those unexpected events occur. But it's not an investment, right? It's not like taking savings and investing it into, an account that is then going to grow over time, right? That's not what insurance is. And so I think it's this misconception of what insurance is and what is the benefit of it. And how is it used in different countries? And insurance is not a one size fits all, right? Covering, your personal belongings of your house or your car are going to be very different from developing and having insurance products for business liability or agricultural products, right? And I think that's another piece too, is that this misconception and misunderstanding of the vastness of what insurance really is, right? It's not just one thing, right? It's multiple. And anytime you can identify a risk, you can create an insurance product to protect that risk. And so unlike microfinance, which has just exploded over the past several decades, right, which is very clear, I think that's part of the challenge with insurance as well, right, is that, how do you explain it in terms that people can understand, right? And it's not tangible. And so I think that is where a lot of the challenge comes in, right? It's paying in and what are you getting out and when and based on what and who is paying it. And I think another large component as well is the timing when payouts do occur, right? For numerous reasons on both traditional and microinsurance, right? It's very difficult to get a payout very quickly. And so people oftentimes will wait around a long time to get the payment from the claim. And so, there are a lot of reasons and, as you and I have talked about before, I think that's where education really comes into play and knowledge and awareness and explanation. And then the other side on insurance too is traditionally insurance has very much targeted the middle market. right? High net worth individuals and companies need very specific types of products, because if they have a large loss, they oftentimes can pay it out of pocket, right? And so the focus really has traditionally been on the middle market, which means that there is a large segment of the population that's just left out. And so I think that's a big piece of it too, right? Is that microinsurance and inclusive insurance is targeting a population that has never really had access to these products and these services before. And so helping to understand what it is and where the benefit is, and why it is needed, it is really one of the big hurdles to overcome.
Cytandra, you mentioned micro and inclusive insurance. So for those listening that, may not have heard those terms before, this, you can insure everything, as you mentioned. There's your health, motor, liability. I know you can even insure cryptocurrency wallets these days.
Oh, now, you can insure anything.
Yeah. I remember I read, there's someone I follow on LinkedIn who works at the Lloyd's of London Museum and posts about different things. I think there's footballers that have their legs insured, and even their voice insured. Some of the top
weddings. There's wedding insurance, right?
Really? Wow. So micro insurance, inclusive insurance, are they the same thing? Are they different things? And what are the key things that are insured in those sectors?
So I think that one of that depends kind of on who you ask. I don't think there's standardized industry definitions around one term versus the other. But generally speaking, I'll kind of give you my take on it is, to me, inclusive insurance is using insurance products to help to include traditionally uninsured or underinsured populations into the insurance market, right? So that's looking at vulnerable, marginalized populations, people who have never had insurance before. So that's how I tend to look at it, is really that provision of insurance products to populations that really need it because they truly are the most vulnerable. Microinsurance tends to be the idea of taking traditional insurance products like property, auto, business insurance, and instead of the premiums being what they would be for you and me, it's on a micro scale. And micro literally means that the premiums could be $2, $3, $4, versus several hundred, right? And so that really is what micro insurance means, is literally traditional insurance on a micro scale, micro premium scale.
$2, $3, $4 for a premium. You have to distribute the product, you have to market, you have to pay claims. Yep. How does anyone make any money on that?
Oh, so fascinating. And it's such a good question. I think it's one of the biggest barriers to entry and expansion in the field. So I think there are several factors. One, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier on efficiency, right? So if you look at a traditional value stream of an insurance company and you look at all the costs that go into making it operate, that is not a model that is going to be sustainable or viable for microinsurance products. So the first thing is figuring out how to take out as much of that expense as possible, right? And a large part of that is technology, right? So where and how technology can play in the space to remove a lot of the touching, the handoffs, the payout process, the claims adjudication process, right? So the underwriting, right? A lot of things that would traditionally require human eyes to be able to do it because the risks are more complex or larger, the risk is larger, et cetera, right? Those are a lot of things where technology and just a simplification of a claims process or an insurance process can make it much cheaper, right? Much less expensive to be able to manage. So that's one critical piece. I think the other one is insurance works when there is scale, right? It doesn't matter what the insurance product is, right? Here in the United States, right, there's long ongoing conversation around health insurance, right? And the United States has really been trying to push to get the entire US population to get health insurance. Not only because, right, the cost of healthcare is so large, but the truth is the more people that pay in, the cheaper it is for everyone. And so that's the other part also when it comes to microinsurance or inclusive insurance, right? the more people that you can have that participate, the cheaper it becomes for everyone. And so trying to go out into the field and sell an insurance product, to farmer by farmer or, business person by business person, right? Like that is a very expensive model with a very high barrier to entry and profitability. And so it really is focusing a lot on what are called group policies, right? Where you have a large group of population that are paying in or already are participating in some other scheme or structure, right? And then insurance becomes an additional add-on. And so it definitely is a viable model, but I think that's exactly the key, right? Is one, figuring out how you make your, the business model, the process, the decision-making, et cetera, as streamlined, simple, and cheap as possible, right? With the fewest handoffs, and then being able to leverage technology as much as possible to really be able to make it efficient. And the second is the scale, right? Is being able to bring as many people as possible into the program so that it reduces the cost per individual.
So you mentioned a farmer. So let's use a farmer as an example. So if I'm a farmer and I want to access an insurance policy, you're saying that the majority of times I wouldn't be able to access it myself as an individual. I would have to be part of a group policy.
You can, and there are several companies that do that right now, right? Where there are people that go into the field and they go into individual communities or community centers or education centers, right? Local governments, et cetera, right? And they do sell the policies one-on-one. Okay. It just makes it a much more expensive business model. It's not that it's not possible, but again, it's one of the approaches. And I think what's also really key, right, that we were talking about is, again, like, it's not a one size fits all, right? And so in some countries or locations, that might be the better avenue because you actually might be able to get more people to participate. But again, right, the point is to have that critical mass, right? It's harder and more expensive to manage the individual policies. So if that's the avenue that's taken, right, you just really have to make sure that you have streamlined operations, ideally with technology that back it up so that it makes it as simple as possible. And there are all sorts of complexities that come into that of, technology in rural areas or where you don't have internet access, but that's a whole other topic of conversation.
Is microinsurance and inclusive insurance mainly found in emerging markets or also in the US, for example?
So I would say less so in the United States. In the US, I would say we generally tend to lag behind in those types of schemes and products. In Europe, it has taken off much more. I would say that it is picking up here in the US, probably with other terms, like we have crop insurance and agriculture insurance, right? So there are other ways of talking about it. I think finally a lot of the insurers here in the US are starting to become more aware of it. That the challenge we find right now is that insurance companies are pulling out of the most vulnerable areas, like the southeast of the United States and Florida and the Carolinas, Cape Cod of Massachusetts, right, where some of the greatest natural disasters are happening. But it's that challenge, right, because you can't use a traditional insurance business model to be viable in these places of recurrent natural disasters, right? You really have to rethink a different model. And so to me, I think that that's also where value of parametric insurance comes into play. Parametric insurance is rather than insuring the physical goods, the house, the car, the property, right? You're actually doing the income replacement associated oftentimes with those natural disasters. And so that makes it also much easier because you don't have to worry about like, okay, well, how much was the house damaged and, what were the goods that were in the house? And so anyway, I think this is just, in my view, a very exciting time for insurance to really rethink what are the risks, who is at risk, where is it located, and how do we rethink insurance and take insurance models from all over the world and combine them and use them in innovative ways, not for the purpose of reducing coverage, but for increasing coverage and access to coverage all around the world.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I keep thinking about the the premium you mentioned, $2 to $4, and especially that's for a population that has a low understanding of insurance. Maybe they haven't, interacted with insurance as something that's very common in their day-to-day lives. So you have the education piece and the capacity building element that's also needed in the marketing campaigns. I don't know if you have the numbers or any statistics to talk through the different percentages and, how many people would need to be insured on that policy for it to become viable.
I don't have the stats at the top of my mind. I will say that a policy that's $2 to $4 in the United States or in another high income country would probably be very difficult to sell. But those are prices that are viable in lower income countries, right? You really have to take into account the cost of living of where you are, right? And so those $2 to $4, those are in lower middle income countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, right? But in the US, right, it would have to be lower than traditional cost of insurance policies, but it certainly is not going to be a $2 or $4 premium. But I think, again, right, it is viable, but you need to take the market dynamics into account. They're like $2 to $4 premium for a farmer who is making, $5 a month, right? That is high, right? But it's all relative to what the dynamics are. And I think that's where, thinking from the perspective of social impact comes into play, right? Like you need to bring that perspective of how to develop programs that are sustainable and viable, and then layering that in with the efficient business model on how to make it work.
What role does the development sector play in inclusive insurance in terms of maybe funding new projects, pilots, or even in distribution of the products that are built to lower middle income countries? Are they playing a significant role, or are they still lagging behind?
So definitely many of the international development agencies are stepping into the space. USAID is, World Food Program, GTZ, right? A lot of companies, mostly in Europe and the US are stepping into the space. I think where one of the greatest opportunities is actually more on the partnership side. So anything that is international development funding is tied to very strict requirements of how those funds can be used for very finite periods of time. And that works really well in some cases, but to me, insurance is not short-term. That is a long-term need. And so that is a business model, right? Insurance is generally for profit, right? This is long-term. And so I think where one of the greatest opportunities is really to forge those partnerships between the funding from the development sector to inject the capital into either existing or startup or even scale up, insurtech and other microinsurance, parametric insurance companies, where the funding is definitely needed, the models are being developed, but it's lacking that capital. And so I think that is where one of the greatest opportunities exists. And so really figuring out how to make that happen, because using a lot of times one of the biggest challenges is that also in the development sector, they don't want to use the funds to pay for premium. They want to use the funds, either for the payouts or, to help to develop business models, but they don't want to use it to actually pay for the premium. And so that's where one of the challenges, as well is, how can we bring and pool together the funds and identify where the viable business models are to really understand, and almost having development entities working like PE or VC firms, like private equity or venture capital firms, right? Is being another source of capital to be able to support for-profit long-term business models that are going to focus on inclusive insurance.
Sure, and I've seen a lot about subsidization, especially on the agricultural insurance side. Governments or development partners that may be subsidizing for a couple of years. But as you mentioned, insurance isn't meant to stop. The project isn't meant to finish. What are your thoughts on subsidizing? Does it work? Can people get away from that, in the long term? Does it become sustainable?
I think there are several pieces. One, I think it depends on what kind of insurance you're talking about. I think if you are anything that's in the agricultural or catastrophic disaster response space, I do think that that subsidies play a significant role, right? If you think of what has happened in Central America and Mexico, I mean, all around the world when these massive natural disasters have hit, the economic impact to those countries as a result of the natural disaster has long-lasting and multi-year consequences, right? So if we take it from that perspective, the use of subsidies to help to either A, replace lost income as a result of the natural disasters, or to be able to use those subsidies and that income to be able to reinvest, help the impacted individuals rebuild their businesses, will help companies in the longer term to rebuild their economies. So I do definitely think that there is a place where subsidies play a role. The duration and details I think are very nuanced, and it depends on which country it is. I don't necessarily believe that there is a space where subsidies could or should be used for, traditional microinsurance types of products. But again, I think we're really at a place right now, if you look globally within the space of inclusive insurance and microinsurance, right, there are a lot of different models that are being tested all around the globe. And so I think we're at a point of really trying to figure out, what works and what doesn't work. What can we extrapolate that seems to really be scalable, either regionally or globally? And, what are different methodologies, and really pooling some of that knowledge to be able to help, model and scale, businesses that either exist or even are coming, that are starting up. But I think it's a fascinating time to really be involved in that creative thinking, both from the perspective of social impact as well as traditional insurance and reinsurance companies, which play a massive role.
Cytandra, you touched on natural disasters. So we're recording this episode during the COP28. Now, when you'll be listening to this on New Year's Day, I know COP will be over. But if you could ask a delegate that is going to COP, a government official, an international development organization, and explain how insurance can be a tool to really fight against the effects of climate change, what would you be wanting them to really do and shout for inclusive insurance in 2024? And on the other side, let's take an insurance executive of a international insurance company sitting in the boardroom. How can they make insurance more inclusive?
Such good questions. Can we spend an extra hour talking about this? So on the first one, to delegates to COP, there are several pieces. One, I think, is really the importance on focusing on resiliency and prevention, on understanding the events, right? The natural calamities and the natural disasters that are happening are only getting more frequent and more severe, right? And from an insurance perspective, frequency and severity are the two critical factors for determining claims, right? So when you take that and you understand that the natural disasters are occurring more frequently and the economic impact is even greater, right? We need to be investing in the prevention side, right? And that can be across the board, right? That could be in zoning of where, new housing and buildings are going up, what kinds of materials are being used to make sure that buildings are going to be resistant against the disasters, when they do occur, elevating properties off the ground, having, windows that won't break, right? Like there's so many different elements that we can think about on an agricultural scale or in lower income countries, right? How do we think about rural populations and helping them to be more resilient, right? Is that different kinds of seeds or fertilizer? Can we be building greenhouses to have backup, in the case that does that, agricultural products or does that, right? Like, anyway, just there are a lot of different ideas and options, but I think really talking about prevention and resiliency and, having worked about a decade in insurance, to me, that is the part that is always left out, right? Insurance talks so much and the focus is on response, right? And reaction, right? But the massive amount of data that exists and is held by insurance companies, we could use that to turn it around and understand where and how do we invest to make sure, to reduce the cost of claims, right? To bring down the what we pay out, not only from the cost perspective, but because of the impact, right? The emotional turmoil and impact that happens to people when they are impacted by a natural disaster or some kind of a loss. So to me, I think that's one critical piece, right? Is for delegates at COP really thinking about the reaction is obviously going to be, and will always continue to be, a component, but starting to think more of the resiliency side, right? Climate change is only getting worse. The impacts are only getting worse. So how can we start to think about preparing and helping populations be more resilient to the change? So I think that is one critical piece as it relates to COP. On the second part of your question on, insurance executives in the boardroom, I think one huge component to that is really thinking and understanding, how do we reframe insurance models, right? There will always be traditional insurance models that we will need to use around our traditional insurance products that are sold on a global scale. But understanding that there are now more factors and risks that we didn't contend with even a few decades ago. What new business models can we put in place? How can we think about being viable and growing in markets that are repeatedly subjected to natural disasters? In the US, right? Like Florida, the Carolinas, Cape Cod, et cetera, the fires out on the West Coast, the freezes that have been happening around Texas, right? That's just on the US side, right? But on a global side, right, it's still applicable, right? So how can we rethink business models to be able to be viable from a financial and business perspective in the markets that are repeatedly getting hit? Because continuing to pull out of high risk markets, one, not only is not going to be viable, because every insurance company is then going to end up pulling out of markets and then saturating the ones that remain, right? So that's not viable. There's going to be even more competitiveness. Prices will go down, right? Which means the profit will go down. So the idea really is, how do we become viable and profitable and impactful within the markets that really are subjected to climate change?
Wow, we need to do this again soon, I think. Viable but profitable, and impactful, and that's the thing. Why does insurance actually exist? It's there to really support those that have an unexpected event or disaster, right?
Yeah.
So if all insurance pull out of those high risk areas, who's going to support them? Isn't that the point of insurance? Cytandra, it's been amazing to have you on the show, and as I said, we need to do this again soon. Hopefully, in person when I'm next in the US. Now, there's one question I asked to all of my guests, and you've worked across lots of countries in lots of different spaces, and you shared some of your experiences with me and our audience today. But if you could have one page in your own social impact journal for a young professional who's just starting out their career in any sector, maybe they're unsure what to do in this current world going into 2024, what would you share with them?
I think there are two things. One is using your voice. I think speaking up, sharing ideas, perspectives, learnings, I think are critical. And the second one is, and this is something that I have grappled with my whole life, is really trying to find the one area to play in, right? If you ask me what I care about, I could write you a book, right? From children's issues to, insurance, right? Across, right? There's a very large, broad scale. But the challenge with that is that to really move the needle and make an impact, you really have to pick something. And so, right, whether that's an industry, whether that is a particular company, right? Whatever it is, but I think there will always be issues that call our attention. And, for those of us that really feel called to act, there will never be limits that call our attention. And so being able to pick, those one or two where we can say, this is really where I'm going to dedicate my time and my energy. And I know that the others are out there and I can address those, in free time, but this is where I'm really going to focus. And so, whether it's an international development, right? And you kind of narrow down what it is in development, or it's in the business space and you kind of find what that industry is, but I think really just having some of that clarity, and picking and acknowledging that there is a lot more out there, but this is what the intentional direction is going to be, I think will really help to elevate your voice and to elevate the impact that you ultimately can make.
I think that's not just great advice for a young professional starting, but maybe for all of us listening, and me also.
Maybe I should take my own advice.
Brilliant. Yeah. So if you'd like to connect with Cytandra, if you're watching on YouTube, you will have seen her social media pages running through, and also her website of her consultancy firm, which I know we didn't talk a huge amount about, but B3C Global, running down the side of your screen. If you're just listening to the podcast, then you'll see in the show notes. Cytandra, thank you once again for joining the Social Impact Journal, and look forward to chatting with you soon.
You too. Thank you so much, Jack. It's been a pleasure to be on here.